very large, snowy white bird stretched his long neck out to her. She had noticed him before because he was the largest, and she thought of him as the leader of the flock. His dazzling wings opened out, and as if on a signal, the entire flock suddenly left their roost and flew straight at her. Too stunned to react, she stood still as the storm of birds surrounded her, their swift circling bringing them closer and closer, until all she could see was a dizzying whirlwind of white wings and yellow eyes. She was caught in a vortex, a living tornado of birds that flew so close, she felt the touch of feathers as their wings grazed against her, and the air churned by their powerful wings blew over her body and fanned her hair wildly around her face. There was no sound save the distant rush of the ocean waves and the swish of wings beating the air. And in her shock and confusion, she felt they were attacking her. Terrified of the sharp bills so close to her face and eyes, she sought a way out. The cruel-looking bills did not touch her, but the birds did not give way, and she threw her arms up to cover her face. Suddenly, she felt something rising within her, something new and powerful and exhilarating. Rising out of the dark abyss, she felt as if, body and soul, she was being transported to the very top of the world. She felt dizzy, a sensation, as if the ground was falling away beneath her feet, went through her, and she felt sure that somehow the whirling birds had caught her and borne her up into the air with them. She felt their wild presence all around her, and one particular presence was stronger than the rest. Focusing her attention, she peered through the flurry of wings. A pair of startling golden eyes gazed back at her from beyond the hundreds of other bird eyes whirling around her, and in them, she thought there was something beckoning to her. She did not see face or form, but the eyes were bright and glowing, and warmth seemed to radiate from them towards her. She closed her eyes against this impossible vision, and when she opened them again, the eyes were gone. She felt unbound, as if her body, her entire being, had been torn apart and put together again in a new and different way. She felt alive, painfully and gloriously alive. Pinpricks of sensation rippled like waves of electricity over her skin, and as if suspended at a great height. As she beheld far below, a beautiful country spread out before her, she saw the sparkle and shimmer of water, and plains of tawny grass bordering dark forests. She was facing the west, and the sinking sun cast a wonderful and mystical light that was both soft and rich over this strange land, and she knew she wanted more than anything to go there. In her eagerness, she took a step forward and gasped at the feeling that she had stepped off the top of a mountain and was plunging back to earth from a dizzying height. "No!" she screamed as a white mist rose up and closed around her. When she opened her eyes, the birds had disappeared and the place had gone dark. She was lying on the ground on the same spot she had been standing when the birds had swooped down. She had no idea how long she had been lying there, but the thin, gleaming crescent of the new moon was hanging low in the western sky, so it must have been a while. The mangroves and coconut trees swayed and murmured in a chilly night breeze, and not a speck of white showed among their branches. She was keenly aware of the sharp bite and rankness of the ocean air, the faint, sickly light cast by the new moon, the never-ending, melancholy murmuring of waves rolling in from the ocean, and the deep despair and cold emptiness of being completely alone. Close beside her lay a single, pure, white feather. She slowly sat up and buried her face in her arms as a wave of disconsolation washed over her. "Why you leave me here?" she sobbed. "I don't want to go back." Afterwards, she made her way back to the sad little shack and threw herself on the old torn mattress with its thin, faded sheets that she and her husband slept on. Through the window opening, she stared at the undulating tops of the mangroves. The birds did not come back that night. Neither did her husband. Her husband had staggered home very late the next morning when the sun was high in the sky and she had finished eating the simple breakfast she had prepared, leaving his covered on the table. His fishing partners had left without him and he was in foul mood. Since she was the nearest available thing on which he could safely vent his anger, by midday she was nursing a cut lip and black eye, and an uncontrollable rage, despair, and something else she could not name were welling unchecked in her heart, though hidden behind lowered eyes and a bent head. Her longing for the birds now permeated every aspect of her being. She barely focused enough to get through the days and nights that now seemed to meld together without any real borders of light or darkness to separate them. The world around her was the color of a perpetual twilight. All her focus was on the silent and bare tops of the mangroves where she gazed long into the night, willing the white shapes to appear, and to which she looked long before the light of the dawn had even begun to silver the eastern sky. The birds did not come. She no longer felt the blows from her husband, nor heard his cussing. She continued to work, to help her husband and his brothers prepare the fish for the market when they came in, to cook, clean, and do everything she had done since coming to this barren shore of misery. When her husband came home reeking of rum and demanded her body with the same uncaring roughness he always took her with, she closed her eyes and saw in her mind's eye the warm golden eyes she had glimpsed only once through a whirlwind of feathers, but which her heart knew so well. And so, for a while, time passed. Evening had fallen. The light was still bright, but faint streaks of crimson were beginning to show in the soft aquamarine sky. She went out into the bare yard and, closing her eyes, stretched her arms out on either side. The wind lifted her unbound hair, and she thought of what it would be like to shed the dead weight of her body, to leave the solid earth and soar into the evening sky towards the dying sun. She had not heard them arrive, but when she opened her eyes, they were there, standing like sentinels from another world, heads sunk into their breasts. The largest of them stood apart from the others. She took an eager step forward, and suddenly, the harsh voice of her husband was grating in her ears. "Gal, why you doing out hey like your head ain't good? You ain't got things to do in the house." A stinging blow to her cheek, and she fell to the ground. Lifting her head, she stared into his eyes, one hand cupping the cheek throbbing from the savage cuff he had dealt her. The fire raging in her breast leaped fleetingly into her eyes, and what he saw there unsettled him. He blinked uneasily, and shifting his gaze from her face, his eyes fell on the motionless white birds that were standing silently looking on, seeing everything. A feeling of apprehension swam through the fog of his drunkenness, and picking up a piece of wood that lay at his feet, he hurled it with all his might at that one bird which stood apart from the rest. But the creature avoided the missile with a graceful and almost disdainful step aside. Swearing at the blasted birds around this place, her husband seized her arm and dragged her to her feet. Snarling at her to get his dinner, he shoved her in the direction of the house. As the last rays of the sinking sun streaked the sky with blood, the round, luminous, pale golden orb of a full moon rose majestically in the eastern sky. Her husband had eaten his dinner with gusto, and afterwards taken his liberty with her body, before finally succumbing to the alcohol coursing through his veins. She lay beside him, feeling nothing, her eyes fixed upon the tops of the mangroves, now silvered by cold moonlight where the birds stood, their snowy plumage glowing and ghostly under the moon. They had observed everything. She sensed the one before she ever saw him. She felt the powerful beat of his wings pulsing in her heart even before he alighted on the windowsill. Then she saw the others, even more than had been there in the evening. A turbulent sea of silvery white, they flew around the house. Hundreds of them circling, rising and dipping, and the swish of their wings filled the air around and gushed into the small house like the wind of a gathering storm. She was aware of nothing but the sound of the circling birds and the steady golden gaze of one. She could not move. Her body was like lead, but the longing in her heart welled to near breaking point. "Don't leave me here," she breathed, not knowing or caring if her husband heard her. "Please, please don't leave me. Take me with you. Oh, please, please, please." Suddenly, she felt the same feeling that had come over her on that evening of the new moon, as if something was rising in her, like a rush of energy bursting out of the pores of her skin. Suddenly, she knew what was happening, and the sensation of exhilaration and light was so intense, it hurt, like a crystal knife slicing through her, cutting her free. She rose noiselessly from the bed and felt herself gliding towards the window, and she saw him, not as a bird anymore, but the image of a tall and beautiful man, standing just inside the room, clothed in white and bathed in a luminous glow, silvered hair throwing off sparks in the moonlight that poured through the window. His face was noble, and his golden eyes were warm and beckoning. She reached out her hand to him, and he took it, and together they turned to the window. He let go of her, and he was not a man anymore, but a bird again that flew out of the window to join the others. She stood for a moment at the window, looking back at her husband, who slept on, oblivious to what was happening. She briefly wondered what he would do when he awoke the next morning. Would he understand? Would he feel any regret or remorse for the way he had treated her? Would he blame himself, or feel sorrow, or relief? She also thought of her own family who had sold her into this life. She looked down at her still body, now empty and hollow, lying next to him, its glazed and sightless eyes still staring fixedly at the window, beyond longing now, beyond pain and despair ever again, but with a faint and mysterious smile frozen on its bruised and beautiful face. And she smiled back. Did she even care what happened tomorrow? He could toss her empty shell into the ocean for all it mattered to her. She was free. She turned her back on the lifeless thing and the sleeping man lying on the dirty old mattress on the floor. She stretched out her long, graceful neck and raised her arms, and the white feathers of her wings glowed pure and dazzling in the moonlight as she flew out of the window. She flew out to join him as the entire flock wheeled in formation and turned their faces towards the west, where the setting sun had long since vanished. The cold moonlight continued to pour in through the open window. The man slept on. The shell of the girl grew colder and stiffer as the moon went down, and when the first rays of the morning sun crept timidly through the window, the shell was beyond all warmth. The birds never came back.